Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour, we're going to spend some time really looking at nations, civilizations, and even those worldviews through history, because we have available at Point of View a number of booklets. One that is out, A Biblical View on Civilization Decline. And in some respects, I did it because we had produced an earlier booklet, which we'll talk about a little bit later this hour, Worldviews Through History, because this particular booklet that came out kind of focused on the fact that we start with kind of this Roman worldview, go through kind of the pagan world, then see the influence of Christianity leading us to the 21st century. And yet, interestingly enough, in many ways, our world in the 21st century is a lot like the first century. But in doing that, it sort of led to the obvious question, and that is, if Rome was such a, really, if you will, stable empire, what led to its decline? And if you want to broaden that a little bit and say, you know, we see the rise and fall of great civilizations. You think of the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks. You can think of the Persians, the Babylonians. I mean, the list is a pretty long list. And then you have some civilizations that lasted for a relatively short period of time, the Etruscans, the Phoenicians, and others. And then, of course, if you've read the Old Testament, you sort of see the rise and fall of Israel itself. So what I want to try to do is for a few minutes to really try to look at, why do civilizations rise, and most importantly, why do they decline? And this is something that has been the study of historians through many centuries, and it has been something that people have written not only whole books, but whole book series on. So this is going to be obviously a shorter look. But the goal here is to recognize that there are some reasons for the decline in a civilization, and some of those seem to be eluding some of our secular historians. One of the things I'll be talking about this hour is family decline. If you think about it, a civilization, a nation, a society is really based upon the family. So if the family falls apart, sooner or later, the nation is going to fall apart. Then we have the whole issue of spiritual decline. I don't think you can really understand Romans 1, that the Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Rome, without his analysis, which I think is a very keen analysis of what was happening in the Hellenistic Greek world. So I want to try to not only add to, but even change some of the focus on the decline of a civilization. Then we're going to come back and talk about some of these worldviews. And so these are booklets that are available through Point of View. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to read a little bit more, or as we always do at the very back of these booklets, we have additional resources. So we point you to other books and other resources that you would find helpful. I hope that you will do so. But again, let's, if we can, first of all, recognize that we're going to be talking about history. And really, to answer this question about civilization decline, we have to study history. And that, of course, is the first problem we can put on the table, because historians come to very different conclusions about why certain events take place and what led to the decline and fall of a civilization. Certainly, economic challenges are part of that, and your Marxist historians are going to view a lot of history through the economic lens. If you go back and look at the history books that were written, say, in the 19th century, before some of these Marxist ideas made their way into the university, you're going to get a very different view of, for example, the American Revolution than you do now. because once the economic analysis began to be rooted into the view of history, you probably have heard that the reason we had an American Revolution is because taxation without representation. I would suggest that what you need to do is go back and look at the Declaration of Independence and recognize that that's just one of about 24 different reasons that were given by the founders, and it really isn't the most significant. But it is an economic reason, so that was the one that surfaced early on in some of the 20th century books trying to even explain something as simple as the American Revolution. Likewise, there are a lot of people that will say, well, the reason Rome fell is because the economy failed. Well, yes, but the barbarians that were at the gate were able to destroy Rome because the desire to defend the republic and later the monarchy pretty much faded away. And so we can also talk about things like social decline and political turmoil that also lead to this as well. But the biggest issue is that even if we do try to learn from history, oftentimes, sadly, we don't learn from history. Some of the quotes I put in the booklet, I think, are very illustrative. George Santayana lamented that those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. The philosopher, George Hegel, said, what experience and history teach us is this, that people and governments never have learned anything from history or acted on principles deduced from it. Or, probably the famous quote from Winston Churchill, one thing we have learned from history is we haven't learned from history. One thing we can at least agree on is this. If you look at the great civilizations that have ever existed, the median age or the average age is about 200 years. So you have countries that are in existence today, like Great Britain, that exceed that age. And you have countries like the United States that are kind of at middle age. And so what we see are a number of these great civilizations oftentimes go through stages of birth to decline to death. And you may have, if you've been out on Facebook, seen something that has been attributed to a 19th century historian, in which he said that basically we oftentimes move from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from great courage to liberty, and then from liberty to abundance. But then things began to decline because now it changes from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to complacency, from complacency to apathy, from apathy to moral decay, from moral decay to dependence, and finally from dependence to bondage. So when we come back from the break, I'll talk about that because what you see, very interestingly, is a movement from bondage to liberty. Many of these civilizations actually came about because of a revolution, came about because of a war or something of that nature. And so as a result, that first generation oftentimes throws off the shackles of bondage, and then the engines of commerce begin to develop, and it begins to be the great golden age of that republic or of that monarchy. But in its success are sown the very seeds of its failure, because the next generation, taking for granted their freedom, their liberty, their affluence, that leads oftentimes to apathy, indifference, and oftentimes even eventually heading back into slavery and bondage. So it's an interesting kind of cycle that we've seen, and there have been times in which those have been interrupted, but there have also been times when those have been almost the iron law of history. So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about that and then move into, okay, if society is based on the family, is some of that due to family decline? I think it is, and we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Dennis Prager recently wrote a column presenting 5 arguments against America is a racist country. His first argument was based on a previous column that asked, if America is so racist, why are there so many race hoaxes? It's a good question. If racism is as prevalent as activists want us to believe, you wouldn't expect so many hate crime hoaxes based on race. In previous columns, I've written about the number of fake hate crimes. There are even websites devoted to the long and growing list of them. All of them come from people trying to prove that this country is full of racism, homophobia, and Islamophobia. In a number of cases, the perpetrators are merely trying to draw attention to themselves. Dennis Prager provides a dozen examples of race hoaxes. Some are fairly well known, like the allegations against the Duke lacrosse team back in 2006. Others are not so familiar. It was amazing to me how many of the examples he provided involved a noose hanging on a truck or around a university lamp. Of course, we have the noose found at the garage of the NASCAR driver Bubba Wallace that was merely a garage pole that existed long before he was assigned that garage. And there's the story of Jesse Smollett. He was supposedly attacked by people wearing MAGA hats and added a noose around his neck to make it even more convincing. The rope was purchased by his two conspirators a few days before. You would think the Jesse Smollett incident would diminish the number of race hoaxes, but I found two more just the other day. A university student said he found a racist note on his car, but surveillance cameras only saw him near the car. And an Oregon commissioner candidate claimed a racist note was put in his mailbox. Eventually, he admitted he actually wrote it. Unfortunately, these race hoaxes keep coming week after week. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking about a biblical view on civilization decline. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, you've probably seen this idea of a nation going from bondage to spiritual faith and courage and liberty and abundance, but then oftentimes in its success are sown the very seeds of its failure, because the next generation, taking for granted that abundance and that liberty, begins to be selfish, complacent, apathetic, and eventually you have moral decay setting in. And so even though I agree that those particular stages take place, I also think that as a Christian, we can see how a revival can change everything. For example, a lot of people believe that America was beginning to already become very decadent, even before the American Revolution, and we had then the first Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. And so that, I think, kind of turned the nation around. Many people say we might not have had an American Revolution without it. After the Revolution, again, you had kind of a complacency, and then we had a second American Revolution, a kind of a second Great Awakening, kind of a revolution in the social area, in which a lot of those people in the second Great Awakening were abolitionists and temperance movement, a variety of other things, and all sorts of great ministries developed there. And even if you look at the Old Testament, a good example is the book of Jonah. I mean, I think you could make the case that really destruction was coming to Nineveh. God sends Jonah to Nineveh, except he takes a really significant detour. But when he does show up, we do know from secular history that a revival of sorts, a spiritual revival, took place. And even though Nineveh was headed towards destruction, we know that it survived another century. So the point I'm making is that we don't want to call this always an iron law of history. sometimes a spiritual revival can turn the nation around. And that brings me to the second key point in my booklet on civilization decline. Because historians that are at least open-minded to looking at some of the social and spiritual issues have noticed a very strong correlation between family decline and the decline of a nation. If you think about it, if a family is strong, in some respects, the family unit is a smaller unit of the nation. And so if the family is strong, the nation is strong. If the family falls apart, often it looks like the nation is headed for decline. Now, I'm not the first person to come up with that. A matter of fact, if you want to read some of the books in the back of our booklet, J.D. Unwin is a British historian who has looked at some of that, and it's fascinating because he's looked at this, what he calls sex in culture, and seen what happens when we don't control our sexual urges, and documents that. And then this Russian sociologist, Petrin Sorokin, The Crisis of Our Age, really began to study lots of civilizations that collapsed. And so you have even kind of more secular-minded historians that are saying this and have noticed this. But in this booklet, I quote from a Christian book written by Carl Wilson, which came out many years ago, Our Dance Has Turned to Death. And what he did was he simply looked at family decline in ancient Greece and in the Roman Empire. And then he talks about the various stages. And again, we don't say that every stage has to follow every other one. Sometimes spiritual renewal or revival will change that. But this seems to be sort of the decline, the, if you will, societal entropy in that direction. Okay. The first stage, he says, men ceased to lead their families in worship. Spiritual and moral development became secondary. Their view of God became naturalistic, mathematical, and mechanical. Now think about this, because he's not talking about what was happening in the nation of Israel or what even happened in various Christian communities. He's just talking about the fact that you had some kind of worship of the gods, Apollo, Zeus, whatever it might be, but then the spiritual dimension faded, which leads to the second stage, where men selfishly neglected care of their wives and children because they began to pursue material wealth and political power and military power. And of course, you've seen this in Greece and Rome. Then material values began to really dominate, and you can kind of see this idea that instead it was all about making money, and it wasn't about building up the family. Which leads to the third issue, and a lot of this now is borrowed from some of the material by J.D. Unwin, and that is the third stage is where you started seeing a change in the sexual values. As these individuals began to be financially successful, pursue political and military power, men who were preoccupied with business or war, first of all, they neglected their wives sexually, or in some cases, they began to be involved with lower-class women. Or, let's also add to that, especially in Greece, but you also saw it in Rome, began to dabble in homosexuality. And so then you began to see this sort of double standard of morality taking place, where, yes, we're married, but it isn't out of love. It isn't even out of a commitment to the children. It's just sort of a societal contract. It's a social contract, but it's not really that meaningful, which, of course, then leads to the fourth stage, because that affects now the women. Because the role of women at home, the role of women and children at home, they lost value, they lost status. Women were neglected and their roles were devalued. Soon they revolted to gain access to material wealth and also to get freedom for sex outside of marriage. Women began to minimize the importance of sex in order to achieve children, and the emphasis was on, just sexual freedom. And even in many of those cases, both in Greece and Rome, marriage laws began to be loosened so that it made divorce easy. The fifth stage, you see husbands and wives competing with each other for money, house leadership, even for the affection of their children. Of course, you have then hostility and frustration. Even now, the development of homosexuality with the children because they don't have proper role models. A lot of these marriages end in separation and divorce. Many of these children were unwanted. Of course, you have in Rome, many of them were aborted. They were abandoned if they weren't the child that you wanted. Sometimes they were molested. They were undisciplined. You had really gangs of undisciplined children roaming the streets in both Greece and Rome, leading to the sixth stage of where selfish individualism grows. It carries over into society. It fragments into smaller and smaller group loyalties. You sort of get almost, if you will, an identity politics. That's a modern phrase, but you see something like it back then. You have a substantial decrease in the birth rate. And so as a result, now you have an older population dependent on a younger population that is smaller than would be necessary for them to be supported. And finally, Carl Wilson says, unbelief in God becomes complete, parental authority is diminished, ethical and moral principles disappear, the economy and government begin to fall apart because now there's fragmentation, there's weakness, and even though you see eventually the barbarians at the gate, in a sense, that's the destruction of that particular republic because it's being held together simply by a dictator, but eventually the invading barbarians take over. And this is kind of the pattern that we've seen in Greece and Rome. But if you've heard me talking about Greece and Rome, you're thinking, sure sounds a little bit like what you're describing, what our world looks like today. Because after all, foundational to a nation are families. Families are the foundation of a nation. When the family crumbles, the nation falls because the nation is built on family unions. A nation will not be strong unless the family is strong. And I thought I'd end this segment by simply quoting from Michael Novak, social commentator. It's been years since we've had him on, but when he was alive, interestingly enough, he said in a very seminal essay about the family this. He said, one unforgettable law has been learned through all the disasters and injustices of the last 1,000 years. If things go well with the family, life is worth living. When the family falters, life falls apart. Okay, we're going to take a break, and just before we do so, let me just mention that we have a couple of these booklets that we are making available, and so I would encourage you to simply go to the website, pointofview.net. You'll find a lot of that, and if you'd like to listen to this again, of course, you know exactly what to do. You can go to the website, pointofview.net, click on the button that says Listen, and then you'll have a chance to hear some of the resources that we are making available and some of the conversation we've had here today. And, of course, it also is available to you by going to the YouTube channel. Let me also encourage you as we go to a break to join with us financially because, after all, we are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring this program to you. So you can click on that button that says Donate. And even a one-time gift would be greatly appreciated. But if you would want to join with us on a regular basis and join the Truth Team, we would love to hear from you. So, again, all of that is available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue looking at some of the trends in the decline of a civilization.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue conversation today as we talk about decline of a civilization, decline of a nation, and also in just a few minutes we'll also get into this booklet that we have on worldviews through history. Both are very important, and if you're just joining us, let me just mention that I've been talking about the importance of history. We've seen some of the stages that even secular historians have noticed in terms of the decline of a nation and decline of a civilization. Then just a few minutes ago, we talked about family decline because that's important as well. And you have British historians like J.D. Unwin and even the Russian sociologist Petrin Sorokin talking about this, but I quote from a very good book by Carl Wilson called Our Dance Has Turned to Death. And I thought now we would finish up this section by also recognizing that there are spiritual components. And my argument would be that if you've ever read Romans 1, and I'm sure you have, you've probably looked at it in terms of Paul addressing the church in Rome, and there's some great theological truths there. But it's also helpful to recognize that spiritual decline oftentimes leads to civilization decline. Often nations fall from within. Yeah, we see the barbarians at the gate and we say, well, they didn't have a strong enough military, and certainly weak nations are taken over by stronger nations. But I'm talking about some of these civilizations that were so very strong, but simply fell from within. And that is sort of the natural trajectory. It's sort of, if you will, the societal entropy, the decline that takes place, because so often what is happening is that if indeed you don't see yourself as important from a biblical point of view or from at least a spiritual point of view, even in these countries we've talked about that did not have the Bible, you still, if you believe in heaven, you believe in a God or gods, there's a tendency then to actually live for more than just yourself. And so oftentimes what happens is if there's a spiritual decline, or then you begin to see a moral decline, you see a moral weakness, and that oftentimes manifests itself even in a military weakness. And there are historians that have talked about how eventually in the Roman Empire there was less of a desire to defend the nation, to find other individuals, slaves, that would be actually put on the front lines to defend the nation, or mercenaries. And so as a result, they weren't the kind of fighting force that you would want if indeed the soldier on the front line is a person defending his own property, his own family. You can see how that would be much more motivating than a mercenary simply getting paid for it, or even a slave being put on the front lines to defend a country that he didn't really care about in the first place. So I think the idea is that spiritual decline sometimes leads to the decline of a nation. And I think we see that very clearly in Romans 1, as the Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Rome, is seeing the decline around him of the Hellenistic world of his time. So let's go through what we find in Romans 1. Because in the first stage, he talks about the fact that people turn from God to idolatry. Although God has revealed himself in nature to all individuals so that they are without excuse, a very clear reference there in Romans 1, they nevertheless tend to worship the creation rather than the Creator. And this, I think, is a biblical definition of idolatry. In the past, this took the form of actual idol worship. In our day, that may take the place in, maybe they don't have idols on their mantelpiece, but instead it's maybe the worship of money or the worship of self. But in either case, that's still idolatry. And a further example of that is maybe even the lack of thankfulness, because they're no longer grateful. They're no longer showing gratitude. Although they have been prospered by God, they're ungrateful. When they're no longer looking to God for wisdom and guidance, they become vain and futile and empty in their imaginations. And again, we see this in Romans 1. They no longer honor God, so in their foolish hearts they become darkened, and professing to be wise, they become fools. So that's stage number 1. Stage number 2 is then when Paul talks about the fact that when men and women exchange their natural use of sex for unnatural uses. And here the Apostle Paul has these 4 very sobering words. God gave them over. In a society that has lust-driven sensuality and sexual perversion, where that begins to dominate, God gives them over to the degrading passions and unnatural desires. And that fits very much with what we were just talking about a few minutes ago in terms of how in some of these stages, 2 and 3, in terms of family decline, you're spending more and more time in sexual debauchery. And either you can spend your emotions and your moral capital to build up the nation, or you can spend that same capital to actually go and enjoy the pleasures of sex and really, in a sense, tear down the nation. And so that, I think, is a very telling turn, because then it says God gave them over. Well, that leads to the third stage, and that's anarchy. Once a society has rejected God's revelation, it's really sort of on its own. Moral and social anarchy is the natural result, and at this point, God has given the sinners over to their depraved mind so that they do things that are not proper, as it says in Romans 1. And that results in a society that is without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, and unmerciful. And so this, of course, describes exactly what you were seeing in the Roman Empire. And I think also illustrates why Christianity took hold, because while children were being abandoned, if somebody had a disease, they were put out on the streets, and the Christians, at the risk to their own lives, would try to nurse and help those individuals that had been abandoned. The Christians would go and adopt the children that had been abandoned in the streets, and this was striking. It was so different to anything that had been seen in that pagan worldview. So the first stage, of course, is this idea of turning from God. The second stage, about they begin to spend their passions on sexual immorality. The third stage, of course, leading to anarchy. And the final stage, as you might imagine, leads to judgment. That is, the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice idolatry and immorality. And certainly, Paul's talking about an eternal judgment. After all, he's now going to write a number of other chapters in the book of Romans about what that means, and really begin to teach us about issues like the justification by faith and the rest. So obviously he's talking not only about an eternal judgment, but there's also, if you will, a social judgment that occurs when God gives a nation over to its sinful practices. When that's where, again, those very sobering 4 words, God gave them over. It's kind of like God says, okay, you want to run your life? You want to abandon biblical principles? I'm going to allow you to actually see the, unfortunately, natural consequences of disobeying biblical commands. And that's exactly what we find there as well. So if nothing else, as we wind down this particular section, then move on in the next segment to worldviews through history, notice that this progression really isn't just unique to the Hellenistic Greek world or the Hellenistic world of Rome that Apostle Paul was living in, because you have seen so often, and I think I've given you some good examples already, of the progression from idolatry to sexual perversion to anarchy to judgment, and that's found throughout history. And we see this perversion and this progression taking place in Greece. We see it in Persia. We see it in Babylon. We see it in Rome. Quite frankly, we see some aspects of that even in the nation of Israel. When the nation was turning its mind towards God in if you will, the Exodus, and then taking the land, there is a great deal of success. Later on, when there is the rebuilding of the wall in the temple, you see it again where they begin to come back to biblical ideas. But you also see times when they turn to their own, where everybody does what is right in their own eyes, and we see what that happens. And so if nothing else, I think we can see how this was a very natural progression described in the Hellenistic world. It's also something we see today in our own nation, and one of the reasons why we need to pray for a revival and reformation, because unless we return to God's principles, decline is inevitable. We come back from the break. I want to talk a little bit about this booklet, Biblical Views on Worldviews Through History, which is something that kind of started this discussion, because it's intriguing that as you look at Rome and then you look at the rise of Christianity in Western culture, in many ways, our world today is a lot like the Roman Empire in the past. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me spend just a few minutes on another book that we make available, and it's entitled A Biblical View on Worldviews Through History. Let me first of all give credit where credit is due. A lot of the material in this particular booklet comes from an individual that's been on this program, Glenn Sunshine, an individual that is a professor in Connecticut. I've had a chance to meet him. I've actually had a chance to preach in his church. He has been very much associated with Chuck Colson and Breakpoint Commentary. His book, Why You Think the Way You Do, The Story of Western Civilization or Western Worldviews from Rome to Home. It came out a number of years ago by Zondervan, and he makes a very good case for the fact that as we move through history, we see that in some respects the Roman Empire and the Roman worldview is replaced by Christianity. And now that we are removing Christianity from a lot of our culture, we're, in a sense, ending up with a worldview that's a lot like the Roman Empire. Back in the Roman Empire, you had this influence of Plato, what was called Neoplatonism. It was a religion, but it was also a philosophy, and it was the belief that there is, a difference between the physical and non-physical. And so this was a worldview that basically had a hierarchy. And because of that, then you had the spiritual, which was superior to the physical. And so as a result, this hierarchy was beginning to be implemented first in Greece and then in Rome, in which, for example, the father had superiority over all of the members of the family. This led to the idea that men are superior to women. It led to the idea that emperors should rule and be worshipped. It led to the idea that slaves were inferior. They weren't even really human beings. They were oftentimes described as living tools. And so in some respects, Rome was successful because of this, but it also had this very ugly underside, a glittering empire, he says, and a rotten core. Human life, of course, because of that, did not have much value. And as I've already alluded to, Romans engaged in all sorts of things. Slavery, of course, was the economic foundation of the empire. Abortion and infanticide oftentimes were regularly practiced. Roman families would usually keep as many healthy sons as they had and maybe only one daughter. The rest were discarded. And into this world came Christianity. First, Christians were very much persecuted. And then as a result, even after that persecution, there was a time in which Christian ideas began to percolate through society. Christians, as I pointed out, really caused a different view because they were willing to rescue abandoned infants. They were willing to oftentimes minister to those affected by the plague, even at a risk of their own lives. They were willing to go and die in these places because they believed there was an afterlife. They believed in God. And the pagans said, I wouldn't be willing to die for this. And so as a result, Christianity began to eventually, after the centuries, began to dominate. And these Christian ideas began to move through the early parts even of the Middle Ages. And two individuals that really helped kind of formulate that were Augustine, writing The City of God and talking about the difference of the city of God and the city of man, and really focusing on and teaching the idea of love and charity and repentance. And then, of course, you also have a variety of other individuals. Aquinas fits into that category. And later on, even in the political realm, people like John Locke writing about these ideas of life, liberty, and property, which seem very important. The development of things like the Magna Carta. And so for a while, you really had this very strong emphasis upon a Christian world and life view. Of course, during the midst of that, you also had the Protestant Reformation. You have the Renaissance. But eventually, it moved into the Enlightenment. And after this, things began to be challenged. There were the beliefs in the past that there was a belief in absolute truth, that our human mind could know that absolute truth, that truth was necessary for society, and that really even that things like the Bible and Revelation would be a guide to determine what is right and what is wrong. But over time, because of some of the wars of the Reformation. People say, well, which Bible do you believe in? Which denomination do you believe in? There began to be a question that people were asking, is Christianity really true? Or which view of Christianity is true? With the discovery of the New World and whole people groups that had never heard the gospel, some people began to ask the question, would it be fair that God would send somebody to hell because they had never heard of Christianity? And so there began to be all sorts of challenges. The rise of science began to be a situation in which they began to say, well, maybe science can give us the answers that theology is not giving to us. And so we move eventually from enlightenment even into our modern world. And so there came to be kind of a rejection of spirituality. No longer was theology the queen of the sciences. Science became the queen of the sciences, if you will. And so as a result, there began to be a development of humanistic thought, even later, a development of what you might call postmodernism, no longer a belief that anything is absolutely true. You have your view of truth, and I have my view of truth, and other people have a different view of truth. The rise of what's called neo-paganism came during that period of time, even things like the New Age movement. And in some respects, all of a sudden, you find yourself in the 21st century saying, this world that we live in today is a lot like the world of the first century. And I've oftentimes said that the 21st century is more like the first century than any century that followed it. And part of that was simply because if you take Western culture and you remove Christianity, you're really kind of back to Roman civilization. And so like Rome, we value toleration as the supreme virtue. Rome believed that toleration was important because it kept the empire together. If you go beyond the lines of what is considered toleration, you are persecuted, and certainly that is the case. The Romans lived in an oversexed society, and certainly a society that practiced abortion and infanticide. So do we. Our society does that as well. Rome was anti-natal eventually, as we pointed out. It began to have a declining birth rate. That is certainly one of the greatest challenges facing today, Western civilization, a society that is sort of collapsing because the birth rate is not even replacing the population. And as a result, sexual focus is the focus instead of trying to raise the next generation. And it all brings us back to kind of the key point. We, as a society, if we do not integrate Christian ideas back into society, will be a lot like Rome. And just as we talked about a few minutes ago, in terms of decline of a situation and a decline of society and a decline of civilization, we face some really significant challenges in the future. So I end my booklet by simply saying, so how should we live in this world? Well, first of all, we need to live out a biblical world and life view. Every generation is called to live faithfully to the gospel, and our generation is no exception. That is especially important today, I say, as we're facing a society that's not willing to accept biblical ideas. And in many ways, we're facing the same kind of challenges that were facing the early church. So again, from history, we can see that the early church did live faithfully and transformed the Roman world, and Christians produced a new civilization, Western civilization and Western culture. So by living faithfully before this watching world, we'll increase our credibility, earn the respect from those around us by living in accordance with biblical principles. If you'd like to know a little bit more, of course, we have our biblical view of civilization decline, our biblical view on worldviews through history, and of course, they're always available through pointofview.net. That's all we have for this hour. I hope you've appreciated the look at civilization and worldviews right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, or you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We have in studio, as I've been talking about, former Senator Jim DeMint. Of course, he also served in the House of Representatives and, of course, was also with the Heritage Foundation, now the Conservative Partnership Institute. And he is one of the authors of this book, Conservative, Knowing What to Keep. We have information about him and his co-author, Rachel, who we're going to introduce in just a minute. But again, Jim DeMint, over the years, we've had you in studio. We've been at various events at Values Voters where we've talked with you and had you by the phone. But it's just always great to have you in this new studio. So thank you for joining us.
It's just so great to be back. And I'm just so appreciative of what you've done for so many years to just be a voice of reason out across the country. And you're in 30-some-odd states right now, and I'm just honored to be with you.
Yeah. I just asked somebody, I think they said 42 states. So that's
42. Okay, well, I'm way behind.
We're trying to get the other 8. You know, I know one of them is Connecticut, and I used to live in Connecticut when I went to Yale, but, you know, we'll keep working on it. But let me also introduce Rachel Bovard, and she used to be with the Heritage Foundation, a graduate of Grove City, and also George Washington University.
Yes, sir.
And it is just great to have you here as well.
Thanks so much. It's my pleasure.
And I'm going to throw these up, and it's going to be double tennis every once in a while. Sometimes she's got it, whoever. But I found the book very helpful because, first of all, maybe I'll just ask you, Jim, we are talking about people that say they're conservative and they really aren't. We're in the election season. You know it as well as I do. Every Republican running during the primary is a conservative. And then they go off to Washington, D.C., or they go to Albany, New York, or they go to Tallahassee, Florida, they go to Sacramento, California, they go to Austin, Texas. We find out they're not so conservative, right?
Exactly. And the main point of the book is to define what conservatism really is for Americans. We want them to know that it's not just about politics. It is about knowing what to keep. It is about those things that make our lives better. A part of that is keeping our faith, keeping our covenants as we the people, keeping our differences. We'll go through some of that today, but we can't build a national movement, a conservative movement, if people don't know what it is. And the left is trying to define it as hateful and bigoted and racism. And so many on the right are just talking about conservatism in terms of their preferred policies. But it's much more than that. And for Christians in this country today, it is a perfect fit with what they know makes their lives better.
Again, there are 12 chapters, and half a dozen of those knowing what to keep, half of those on knowing what to fix. And so we'll try to cover both of those. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know more, well, that's why we're talking about the book, and it is available. We have a link to the website, of course, the Conservative Partnership Institute, but also you can get it on Amazon and other places as well. And Rachel, let me come to you for just a minute, because one of the things I thought would be really relevant is we do a millennial roundtable. And even though these are really smart people that we bring in on Tuesday, I bet if I said, who is Russell Kirk, they'd all say, I'm not sure who that is. And it is something that we need to bring to this next generation, your generation. True?
Yeah, I think that's right. And if they didn't know Russell Kirk, it's because they didn't go to Grove City College. I'll tell you that much. But yeah, we spent a lot of time with Russell Kirk, who is the father of conservatism
That's
for
true.
a lot of folks, wrote The Conservative Mind.
That's right.
Really brought conservatism, from Edmund Burke in the 1700s forward into the modern era. And what we really try to do in this book is to re-articulate a lot of the Kirkian conservative traditions for this current generation. And, Kirk says that that's the job of conservatives. He says every generation needs to be reminded of what conservative principles are. And so we're sort of taking up the mantle humbly that Kirk has given us to do just that.
And I'm just thinking that Jim DeMint and I are about the same age. And when I was growing up in California, we had a guy that ran for governor by the name of Ronald Reagan.
Right.
And it's interesting because my father ran for the California Assembly in 1962, which is the year which Richard Nixon ran as governor. They both lost. And then he ran in 64. And that's when Barry Goldwater was running. They both lost. But then in 1966, something changed, and that is Ronald Reagan won, and my dad got involved in all sorts of other activities. But Ronald Reagan used to say that really this idea of America, the republic, conservatism, it's not passed on through the bloodline.
Exactly.
You have to pass the baton on from one generation to the next.
Every generation has to fight for freedom. It doesn't come to us naturally. And this generation, and I think even a lot in our generation, don't know what those things are that blessed us so much as a country. And so what Conservative does, the book Conservative, is just help people look at the thing much broader than politics. The things in our civic society, our families, our communities, our churches, the things that really create the lives that we value. We need to know what they are and know who's trying to take them away. And more importantly, why are they trying to take them away? That's what the second part of the book is about.
Let's get to chapter 1. It talks about covenants. Rachel, let me talk about that for just a minute. If you've been to Hillsdale or Grove City or a few other places, maybe you could answer that. But you talk about this idea of an American covenant. And we, many times around here, talk about biblical covenants. But that's an important first chapter in the book, isn't it?
Yeah, it really sets the stage for what conservatism is. And it was actually Senator DeMint that really keyed into this concept of covenant. And I think it's so appropriate because the idea of covenant is simply that, we are in covenant with one another, right? We're in covenant with Christ through our faith. We're in covenant with one another through marriage. But as citizens, we're also in covenant. And I think that speaks to a lot of what we've lost in our modern political discourse. People aren't taking care of one another. They don't look at themselves as a country together. We've lost the unum in e pluribus unum to some extent,
right.
And that's a reflection of the covenant principle. And so that really leads into a lot of the other conservative principles but it starts fundamentally with this idea that we have a responsibility to ourselves and each other and the country, and that is the covenant we are all trying to keep. How we meet that out is our politics, but overall, this is the agreement that we need to keep.
And we talk about a social contract, but that's a very different idea, isn't it, than covenant, isn't it?
Very different because it doesn't have that mutual commitment that comes with it. And it's not a top-down phenomenon. And so much of politics today is dividing us all into groups, fomenting mistrust, trying to play one against another, and telling us that only government can save us from this other group. The covenant idea just is built from the ground up. All the little platoons that Burke talked about, helping us understand that we are fellow Americans. We may have different politics, we may be in different denominations or churches, but we have a covenant with each other as citizens that makes us one. It doesn't mean we're not different, but we are one as American citizens. And in fact, I think a lot of that, it still exists across the country. If you get outside of Washington, outside the media, Americans love each other. We work together. We go to school together. And it's only the higher ups who are trying to gain political power by dividing us by beliefs, by race, by gender. So this covenant idea is the very beginning of understanding who we are as a country. And it really goes back to the covenant God made with the people of Israel, with Moses, and the covenanting with God and with each other. And that gives us the civility to deal with all the things that we have to deal with as a society.
One of the chapters, of course, keeping our covenants and also keeping our faith. And we'll talk about that after the break, because, again, that's an important aspect of that as well. De Tocqueville and others will bring some of that to the conversation. Then also keeping our differences, keeping our republic, keeping our institutions and traditions. That's an important one. And keeping our land of opportunity. That's just the first 6 chapters. We'll try to cover as much as we can, but we'll do that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Dennis Prager recently wrote a column presenting 5 arguments against America as a racist country. His first argument was based on a previous column that asked, if America is so racist, why are there so many race hoaxes? It's a good question. If racism is as prevalent as activists want us to believe, you wouldn't expect so many hate crime hoaxes based on race. In previous columns, I've written about the number of fake hate crimes. There are even websites devoted to the long and growing list of them. All of them come from people trying to prove that this country is full of racism, homophobia, and Islamophobia. In a number of cases, the perpetrators are merely trying to draw attention to themselves. Dennis Prager provides a dozen examples of race hoaxes. Some are fairly well known, like the allegations against the Duke lacrosse team back in 2006. Others are not so familiar. It was amazing to me how many of the examples he provided involved a noose hanging on a truck or around a university lamp. Of course, we have the noose found at the garage of the NASCAR driver Bubba Wallace that was merely a garage pole that existed long before he was assigned that garage. And there's the story of Jesse Smollett. He was supposedly attacked by people wearing MAGA hats and added a noose around his neck to make it even more convincing. The rope was purchased by his 2 conspirators a few days before. You would think the Jesse Smollett incident would diminish the number of race hoaxes, but I found 2 more just the other day. A university student said he found a racist note on his car, but surveillance cameras only saw him near the car. And an Oregon commissioner candidate claimed a racist note was put in his mailbox. Eventually, he admitted he actually wrote it. Unfortunately, these race hoaxes keep coming week after week. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking about this new book, Conservative, Knowing What to Keep. And a little bit later, we're going to talk about knowing what to fix. But knowing what to keep and the importance of faith. And in there, you use some good examples. You know, the Boy Scouts of America, where the very center of American life, and now they're one of the most vilified organizations in the 21st century. You talk about Masterpiece Cake. And, of course, we could talk about all the individuals that we've talked with, whether it's Jay Sekulow, certainly Kelly Shackelford and others. But these are all very important cases. And I think right now, wouldn't you say, Jim, that we are kind of in a balance between, are we going to really understand the importance of religious liberty, or are we just going to simply see that as an excuse for anti-LGBTQ kinds of things?
It's an important time because I really do feel we're at a crossroads, particularly in Washington. And we point out in the book a number of the hearings that they have now for confirmation Christianity's on trial.
Yes.
I mean, they are saying you should not confirm someone if they believe Jesus Christ is the only way to heaven. And that's against the Constitution, yet they do it blatantly now in Washington. Russell Kirk said the very beginning of a free society and of conservatism is a belief in the transcendent order.
Right.
In other places, he said a belief in a fixed moral code. And that is another thing that can unite us as a country if we all believe in this order. We might have different versions of God, different denominations, but if we all understand there is a transcendent order that we all are under, that is our master in effect and not the government, then we behave very differently as citizens. And it takes us back to the covenant idea, me, you, and God. We're going to behave very differently if it's me, you, and government.
Yes. And founders, I would think, Rachel, are individuals that understood that this would only work. A constitution really only works if you have a moral and religious people. Because if you have to have a police officer on every street corner and you don't have people doing the right thing without coercion, it's just never going to work.
That's right. And the founders really understood that it wasn't just one religion, right? It was this transcendent order. You had framers that were Unitarian, they were deists, they were Catholics, they were Protestants, but they believed in the idea that we still know to be true, that a religious society is full of happier people, more responsible people. They look out for one another. But the left, their religion now is atheism. It's a secular society. They want religion to have no place in it. And the role of conservatives is not to say you have to believe what I believe. It's that belief is good.
Yeah.
And that's where we're at right now.
Yes. Well, again, there are so many other points, but I want to keep moving because another one is keeping our differences. That gets us into identity politics. Jim DeMint, speak to that, if you might, for just a minute.
Well, the left claims to be for diversity, but if you're around them at all, they want uniformity in almost everything that you believe in value. They try to make differences based on just color of skin or surface ideas like that, but they really do not tolerate differences of opinion. If you don't agree with them, you're wrong. And they are becoming vicious and even violent about people who disagree with them. They don't even want to consider the facts about any of their big issues. But conservatism is really, like Russell Kirk says, celebrating people's differences, promoting and protecting those differences. And that's how you live together in peace if you're all different. And your neighbors can be completely different from you, and you can be great friends as long as he doesn't tell you you have to be like he is. And that's the problem of top-down central management, particularly when the federal government is telling all the states and all the people that they have to do certain things. They have to go to certain schools. They have to have certain health care. They have the same. That's when people get tense. That's when they become divisive. But diversity is a core principle of conservatism.
We're going to talk a little bit later about what to fix, and part of that is the left. And even just recently, we had Dennis Prager sit in that very chair here, and he's made an argument that I agree with, that it is traditionally conservatives and liberals may have disagreed, but even our liberal friends, and I've had Alan Dershowitz on many times before, he would be the typical liberal, or Jordan Peterson has been on, and some of these people that would basically say, I may disagree with you, but I support your right to say that. Mm-hmm. And so that's been the case, and that's been the view that liberals and conservatives have had. But the left says, no, you don't have a right to that point of view. And any kind of view that strays even a little bit from the plantation is something that immediately will cause people to riot, to prevent you from speaking. And I've been the recipient of some of that on college campuses and things like that. And so, Rachel, this kind of new generation is saying, we don't want to hear this. We just want trigger warnings. We want safe spaces, and we don't want to wrestle with the big ideas.
Yeah, we call those snowflakes, I think is what we call them. But it is a really dangerous thing. You know, I think it reflects poorly on an understanding of what America was founded on, which is incredible diversity. We have one of the most diverse societies in the world. And that is a fundamentally conservative idea to protect that diversity. I think this generation, my generation as a millennial and the generation below me, they get caught up between conflating equality of opportunity with equality of outcome. Mm-hmm. And they don't understand that in the middle of that are people exercising their own individual choices and individual gifts. And that's what makes American society unique, is that everybody has a different thing to offer and everybody has a chance to offer it here. And we don't do a good job, I think, of communicating the value in that.
And again, one of those is Keeping Our Land of Opportunity. And one of the booklets I have is on capitalism and socialism. Why do I have this one? Because unfortunately, your generation, not you and not many of our millennial roundtable people, but a very high percentage of individuals who identify as Generation Y or millennials or Generation Z or the iGen generation say, you know, I think socialism is better than capitalism. I want to send them to Venezuela or Cuba to figure that out. But, Jim, that's kind of a generational thing. We're old enough to remember when we say socialism, we think Soviet Union, we think North Korea, we still even see China, a topic we'll be addressing in the future. But the younger generation says, oh, I kind of like Bernie Sanders. I kind of like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And so this is another great challenge for the 21st century, isn't it?
It really is, and it's harder for younger people, and we point it out in the book. You and I have the benefit of time. We've watched things, we've made our own mistakes, we've seen countries come and go. We know socialism doesn't work. Part of the problem that millennials have is not only have they not seen outcomes over time, but they have not been taught the mechanics behind the prosperity that we have right now. And we call it capitalism or free market economics, but they have different views of what socialism is. They really don't understand socialism in its real sense. And so it's been masquerading as compassion, as let's share and everything. But once you talk to millennials directly and younger people directly about what this means, okay, we're all going to get C's because some got D's and some got, you put it in their terms and all of a sudden they say that's not fair. That's the first thing that comes out of their mouth.
Yeah, it goes to a really good point, I think, that doesn't resonate enough. It's very, very easy in a socialist country to make everybody the same at the bottom. It is very, very hard to make everybody the same at the top. And so socialism, in its natural progression, distills us all down to the very, very bottom. And if that's where everybody wants to live, I highly doubt they do, but that is the logical conclusion of socialism.
And one of the things that you do, and I hold this up at least for people watching, it's just an unbelievable chart, and it's something we've talked about with many people, how because of a free market, the world's GDP or GNP, whichever one you want to use, is just gone almost exponential. And we have raised more and more people out of extreme poverty. So it is a time when we have perhaps the greatest economic development, the greatest standard of living. And yet, unfortunately for your generation, we have what I write about, what I call the deaths of despair. Higher suicide rate than even I had when I was growing up in Berkeley, California. We have individuals with opioid overdoses. So even at a time with tremendous blessings, just a lot of pessimism and depression and a belief that socialism is the way out.
Yeah, and this really gets back to what it means to be a conservative, because all of those things you cite, these despair, these are existential questions. These are philosophical questions about how we live together. The left's answer is everything is fixed by the government. Conservatives, on the other hand, say, no, there's way more important things in life than politics, and one of them is family, church, or community. All these things matter.
When, again, you also talk about this, and we'll get into this in the next hour. Government is the answer. See, this is the government that supposedly had shovel-ready projects that weren't shovel-ready. This is the government that allowed veterans to die because of problems at the VA. This is a government that was supposed to make affordable care, because it was called the Affordable Care Act, and it doesn't look very affordable. And we think that more government is the answer. Bernie Sanders, call your office. I don't think so. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we have a lot more to cover, and we've just barely touched on knowing what to keep. But we do need to spend some time talking about knowing what to fix. And that's something we talk about every day here on Point of View. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know more about the Conservative Partnership Institute, we have a link to it at our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to know about the book, we have information and a link to that as well. And if, as you're listening to this, you say, I know somebody that needs to hear this, you can click on the button that says listen, and you can download the podcast and send it to them. Or you can click on the button that says watch. And of course, you can watch the live stream, or it'll also be on YouTube. You may know some other millennials that need to hear this as well. But we'll take a break and come back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again as we talk about this new book, Conservative, Knowing What to Keep. Jim DeMint with us, Rachel Bovard. And again, if you would like to join us, you could maybe give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. But I suspect this is going to be one of those programs where I'm going to encourage you maybe just to sit back, listen, take some notes. Then maybe, since it comes very fast and furious, go and listen to the podcast again. Maybe send it to someone, and most importantly, get a copy of the book. Endorsed by a number of people, including Mark Levin, and, of course, a number of other members of Congress that have actually written this, including Congressman Jim Jordan. So just a lot of great material in this book. And so I'm going to dive deep again. And one of the things that's kind of a theme running through this, Rachel, is tradition. Now, your generation sometimes said, why do I need to worry about the past? But tradition helps us understand how not to make the mistakes of the past. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think conservatives get a really bad rap for this. You know, people think of conservatives as sort of fusty. You can't do this, you can't do that. But that's not it at all, right? Conservatism, more than anything else, is a philosophy of gratefulness. And this is particularly true about tradition. We're really grateful for what people have done before, the hundreds of years of experience they've given us tackling the same problems, because human nature doesn't change. The same problems come up and up and up again. And so looking back at what's worked, what hasn't worked, and allowing that to inform the discussion going forward, that is essentially conservative. And so that's that concept. You know, Edmund Burke really talked about standing on the shoulders of giants and looking forward and taking that accumulated wisdom and using it to our benefit. That's incredible that we have that opportunity. And that's what's really exciting about being a conservative.
And that kind of gets into chapter 7, if you think about this, because it gets into this issue of good intentions. When Dennis Prager was here recently, he had an equation, GI minus W equals E, and that was good intentions minus wisdom leads to evil. And in this chapter, you talk about the fact that people have good intentions, but if you don't have any collective wisdom, I don't think too many people wake up each morning and say, now, how can I ruin the United States of America?
Right.
How can I ruin my country in Ukraine or my country in Hungary or wherever it might be? But if you don't have some sense of tradition, some sense of, if you will, wisdom that you gain, you sometimes, in trying to do good, do tremendous harm.
We've seen a lot of that at the federal government level. There are a lot of folks up there who have very good intentions and good motives. I'm afraid the left and the progressives have gone over to the evil side, but they're bringing a lot of good people along with them. But folks who want to do the right thing and don't have any of the knowledge of what's worked in the past or any respect for the things that have worked are likely just to take these new theories and ideas of, okay, how can we help the poor? Let's just give them money. Let's just give them housing. But if you look at it over time, we have not helped them. We've ensnared them and trapped them in dependency, and we haven't given them a way out. We've taken their dignity, and that's not right. It's not right for our country, and it's not right for the individuals. So if you really are compassionate, let's look at what has really helped people over time. And so it relates to raising children. It relates to being a community volunteer. But when you get at the government level, if you think the way I'm going to help is to get government to do it, I have not seen that work yet.
Again, the war on poverty and poverty won, right?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's a good example of that. And it really gets to chapter 8 as well. And that is not just only good intentions, but one of the things you say there, and something we've talked about before, the left almost seems to destroy everything that it touches. And it isn't just in the political realm, because we also talk about how it's affected the cultural realm. And we could get into all sorts of transgender issues and cultural issues and sexual issues and gender confusion and all the rest. But just even back to government policies, in trying to do good, we've done a great deal of harm, haven't we?
We sure have. You mentioned the Boy Scouts. And the Boy Scouts were one of the foundational institutions in our country, and so many of the great leaders in our country and astronauts, business leaders over time have gone through this Boy Scout program. But over the years, they were attacked. Over 30 lawsuits. I wrote a book over 10 years ago, and I was so proud of them for withstanding that. But the government, the media, and particularly corporate donors eventually just wore them down. They threw out their moral code, and now they're on the verge of bankruptcy, and you don't see anyone from the left coming to help them, to rescue them. And that's what the left does. They tear things down. It's not enough for them to have the freedom to do what they want to do. They don't want others to have the freedom to do something else. And that's what we're seeing more and more today, is just the destruction of those traditions, those ideas that have held this country up for so long, and they're not putting anything in its place.
Rachel, I thought we maybe also talking about the need to get alternative sources of information. First of all, you write the Weekly Compass, which is available at the Conservative Partnership Institute. But whether it's that or this talk show or a variety of other outlets, if all you knew about what indeed the left wanted to do came from reading the New York Times or the Washington Post, then you would be concluding that that is the solution. But when you actually look at some of the other studies, matter of fact, some of the ones you did at the Heritage Foundation and others, you realize that in many cases, almost every time the left touches something, they ruin it.
Yeah. If all you read is in the New York Times, you are in dire straits. You must think we are on the precipice of destruction based on everything they put out every day. We're actually doing much better than that. You know, Senator DeMint travels a whole lot. We hear from people all over the country that are very conservative at heart. They want to keep what's important to them, and they're grateful for the sacrifices that have made this country strong. But I think to that point, that's why it's so important to get outside of the bubbles that you're constantly in. I write the Weekly Compass email, which you can sign up for on our website, that tries to tell you a little bit about what's going on in Washington from a conservative perspective. But, you know, I write for a lot of conservative media organizations, the Federalist, Washington Examiner, American Greatness. These are all really good places to get a different view than the one you're getting on your cable news.
And so, again, that's one of the reasons we're doing this today here on Point of View. And if nothing else, one of the things that people have always appreciated, Babe, since you're authors, it's really nice to have an entire hour to try to talk about a book instead of, a 2-minute soundbite.
Thank you for that.
or all sorts of conversations about everything other than what's in the book. And so I thought we'd come back to one of the chapters there, the siren song of socialism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've already sort of addressed that. But, Rachel, let me stay with you for just another few minutes, because when you go and do surveys, and we've done some of those, and we ask people your age or younger, why do you like socialism? The word that comes up is equality. Mm-hmm. And I saw how the word equality was used to justify same-sex marriage, and I see how equality now is being used to suggest socialism. You pointed out that socialism can make everybody equal at the lowest rung, but it gets back to this idea of the equality of opportunity rather than the equality of outcome. Sometimes we might say, I feel like it doesn't seem right that some of these NBA players or NFL players make so much more than a hardworking teacher in the ghetto region. But once you have freedom, you're going to have different outcomes. And it seems to me that we should give everybody the opportunity to pursue their hopes and dreams, but that isn't going to give you the same kind of outcome.
That's right. And it really goes to the fact that we're not all the same person. And that should be celebrated. The left always talks about diversity, but they don't want you to actually have different gifts and use them accordingly, because that leads to different outcomes. But that's an incredibly important part of being conservative, is celebrating those differences and the ability to make choices based on the diversity that you have. C.S. Lewis makes a really good analogy to this in the Screwtape Letters. If anyone's familiar with this book, when Screwtape is training the next generation of devils, he said the first thing you have to do to get at their souls is to make them all equal. Because you take a scythe and you cut off the tall wheat and you make it the same as everybody else, and then they just stop caring. And they don't care about anything anymore.
Lot of wisdom there.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis. And one of the things I want to talk about, maybe when we come back from the break, is you also have a whole section here on some of the policy failures. Mm-hmm. We've already talked about the war on poverty, but I'd like to get some thoughts maybe from you, Jim DeMint, about the issue of education and, of course, health care. And, of course, we can also talk about climate change, another one of those topics that we've addressed. But it does seem to me that this is a classic illustration of trying to do good. We've done a great deal of harm. And I just cannot, even as we look at the various elections, see how anybody looking at the cost of Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, trying to make sure that we provide all sorts of benefits for people in terms of child care, make sure that we can forgive all college loans. Rachel might like that one, or a variety of others, or reparations, and not just reparations for African Americans, even reparations for LGBT and all the rest, how people don't look at that and go, That makes absolutely no sense at all. So let me just take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about this. But as we mentioned, you can go to conservativepartnership.org, and we have a link there on the website. And, of course, you can get a copy of the book, and that is available there. We also have that as well. We also have some of the endorsements that have come from Senator Mike Lee and Representative Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan and Mark Levin and a variety of others. But if you'd like to get that weekly compass, I'm going to sign up for it. And I'm going to find out what Rachel is writing about. That's another one of those maybe must-reads for everybody. So you can sign up. All you really need to do is just put your name there, your zip code, and your email. You can join and find out a little bit more about that. And, of course, if you'd like to really learn about this topic, this is a great book to get that information. So we're going to take a break and talk about some of those policy failures right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking about conservative, knowing what to keep, and, of course, also the Conservative Partnership Institute. We have that link on our website. Jim DeMint, let me come to you for just a minute. Chapter 10 talks about these policy failures on the left. We've mentioned some like poverty, but what about education? When we got the federal government involved in education, and I remember at the time when Jimmy Carter created a Department of Education, right. And then the Republicans said, we're going to get rid of it. And then we put Bill Bennett in there and said, well, we kind of like Bill Bennett. And Gary Bauer was there for a while until he went to the domestic policy, and we didn't get rid of that. I think federal government's involvement in education has done more harm than good. What's your thoughts?
There's no question about it. And we cannot maintain a free society if the education of our children is managed by our government. It's completely opposite. We're supposed to hold the government accountable, but yet we have the government running our public schools and essentially our universities through the grants and funding process. But the solutions are so clear. We have so many examples now that states are doing things that give parents more choice. And the idea of education savings accounts opens the door for Christian families to use money without any government strings to actually send their children to a place that will help them raise their children under the admonition of the Lord. And every church in a country could easily hire a teacher or two, and whether it's a class of 20 or several hundred. But you also could have all kinds of different schools that specialize. It would attract a lot of private sector money investing if you created a mall of education where kids could go. We don't have to be strapped to government-run schools. And as long as we do, and if people don't understand this, even if they think their school is good, the national teachers unions, which are socialist at the leadership level, are driving public education in America. And it's really the socialist left that's driving a lot of higher education as well. So we have numerous states now that have done various versions of charters and magnets, and we can see that every time they do it, you create better options for students, but also public education gets better. So we're not eliminating something that parents want, but for heaven's sakes, let's stop doing something that has failed since that very time Jimmy Carter intruded the federal government into education.
And a lot of times people do say, Jim, that, this is a good teacher. But my argument is, put a good teacher in a bad system, and the system wins. And that's really what's happened. There may be good teachers, but the system just drives it in the wrong direction. And, of course, the teachers' unions do as well.
Yeah, we can't expect 2 hours of church on Sunday and like 40 hours of secular education that our children will grow up without conflicted ideas of what is real in the world. And that really pains me because you might have a very good teacher, but if everything is taught within a secular setting, the biology, creation, everything, our children are not going to grow up with confidence in their faith.
Yes. Rachel, Jim mentioned something just in passing, and that is some of us remember when people like Ronald Reagan talked about the states being, if you will, laboratories for democracy. And we see that with education. I just wrote something recently about some really significant changes in health care and health savings accounts in Indiana. Who was the former governor of Indiana? Oh, I think it's the vice president.
I think it rhymes with Mike Pence.
Yes. And it's just, I think there's a good example of sometimes we find things work at the state level. Let's make it national. Our friends on the left, they want to just have everything from a national point of view and oftentimes implemented by people that have never run a business and really have never even been in a think tank to actually understand the implications of what they've just implemented.
Yeah, and it goes back to the fact that they want to make us all the same. They think we are all the same. And that's one of the beautiful things about our federalist system is that it recognizes that we're not. It recognizes that people in Montana have very different needs than people in New York. We have a system that reflects that. And it really is something to be grateful for. We can experiment at the state level. We can learn from things that work and don't work. Look at California implementing all these policies that are actually making their residents flee to other states because they're taxed to oblivion and they don't like their policies. That's good to know. That maybe the rest of us don't want to live under those scenarios.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, they're paying a lot more for gas, and that's because they're more dependent on Saudi Arabia oil than anybody else. As an individual who's born in California and understands that it's a very different world than when Ronald Reagan was the governor. I mean, they're closing down refineries. They are not drilling new oil wells. And so they're paying a lot more for gas than the rest of the nation listening to this broadcast right now. And that's just one good illustration. But we're just about out of time. And you have a whole section here on, the flourishing of society and the need to get involved. And one of the booklets I'm going to put out again, Making Your Vote Count. It seems to me, Jim DeMint, you've been on the receiving end of various campaigns and worked in other campaigns. You worked in advertising, but you recognize that if we could just mobilize even just the listeners to Point of View to make sure that they are registered to vote, and I suspect many of them are, but then to get their friends, neighbors, coworkers, and family members registered to vote, and then to turn out to vote, these ideas would be implemented instantaneously, and we wouldn't be fighting some of these battles we're fighting right now on Capitol Hill.
You're exactly right. And I've seen data, and I think it's right, that over half of folks who go to church, evangelical Christians, don't vote. Yet we sit on the sidelines and complain about it, and we expect things to work out. Or maybe we believe that politics has nothing to do with our families, our faith, and our freedom. But I can tell you, it does. And we cannot allow the country to continue to go on an unsustainable course. And it really is, fiscally, culturally. I just would encourage folks to register to vote, plan to go out, but like you said, just encourage someone else to go. Take someone else, make it a thing in your small group or your church or the people you hang out with. If we could just get good common sense Americans to vote, I think we could turn this country around. And I hope folks will read the book just to find out what it is we're trying to do, what are we trying to keep, and how does that translate into policy.
Yes, and anybody that has any doubts, you can go to our website. I've been collecting over the years some of the closest votes in American history. Had somebody sitting in that chair the other day that won by 30 votes, so he recognizes. But I did have an individual I used to work with when we were on Moody Broadcasting, and it actually ended up to be a tie. And so they flipped a coin, and she lost. And then she went to church that Sunday and said, "Oh, if I'd only known that this was going to be that close, I, was working late at work and I didn't bother to go to the vote, and or I was out of town." And she identified 30 people in her own church. If just one of them had voted, she would have been reelected in the Illinois legislature. So
what a
don't
heartbreaker.
tell me that one vote does not matter. Rachel, just before we run out of time, let's, if we can, real quickly talk about what's available at your website. And again, I would encourage people to just click on your picture there, and we have information at conservativepartnership.org. And if they scroll down, they get the weekly compass. What is that all about?
Yeah, so it's a weekly email that I write based on what's going on Capitol Hill that conservatives should care about from a House and Senate perspective. So if you want behind the curtain, inside information, sign up for my email.
Again, conservative, knowing what to keep. Senator Jim DeMint, it's been great to interact with you over the years, and thank you for the work that you've done first in Congress, as well as the Heritage Foundation, and now, of course, at the Conservative Partnership Institute. And Rachel, it's just great to meet you. Can we get you on the Millennial Roundtable in the future?
I would love to.
Okay. Well, it has been just a great opportunity to hear from them. And again, if you would like some more information, click on the button that we have there. It says conservativepartnership.org. And again, there is this opportunity for you to sign up, and I'm going to do that in just a minute, the Weekly Compass, and then you can find some of their material. But if you say, I really want to pass this on to some individuals, go to our website, pointofview.net. There's a red button there. One is listen, and you can download the podcast even right now, send it by email to somebody that you think needs to hear this, or you can watch it or even go to the YouTube channel a little bit later and pass that on, because as we've pointed out before, there's a whole generation of young people that don't know these values, and so we need to pass them on to them. So thank you both for being in the studio. We've got a lot more to cover. We will do that right after these important messages.
"2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to get back to the Bible, and this is a great opportunity to talk with our good friend Dr. Ron Rhodes, an individual that is an author of more than 70 books. I can think of a number like the End Times in Chronological Order, Bible Prophecy Answer Book, Unmasking the Antichrist, great debates on Bible prophecy, 40 Days Through Revelation, 40 Days Through Daniel, as well as North Storm Rising, and a variety of other books that he has written over the years. Individual that holds both a THM and a THD degree in systematic theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, is a teacher at Dallas Theological Seminary, as well as Veritas Evangelical Seminary, Talbot Seminary, Biola University, and a number of others. And we oftentimes talk about prophecy with him, and we will in just a few minutes talk about one of his other books. But I wanted to also let you know about a very good book that would kind of help you put the Bible together. It's called A Chronological Tour Through the Bible. It is broken down into 365 days, and it's just a great way to begin to understand the Bible, put it in the right order. It's broken down into 9 different eras. And Dr. Ron Rhodes, always great to have you on the program with us.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's always a pleasure for me. Thanks.
We're going to do a prophecy in just a minute, and that is certainly a question that a lot of people have in light of what's been happening in Saudi Arabia with the drone attack, what's happening in Iran, what has been happening in Syria. Just the other day, we talked about how an Iranian general says that actually removing Israel would be something that is quite possible. So there's a lot of prophetic things to talk about, but I thought for just a minute I would focus on this book that is published by Harvest House. It's a 1-year chronological tour through the Bible, and I think one of the blessings is that people sort of read the Bible in fits and starts, bits and pieces, and what you do is you try to break it down into a meaningful chronology so that it finally makes sense and helps people understand how to put the whole Bible together. So talk about how people can benefit from this particular chronological tour through the Bible.
Well, you know, the Bible from Genesis to Revelation is really a story of human redemption. And when you take a chronological approach to the Bible, you can actually understand the redemption drama as it chronologically unfolded back in ancient times. And so that helps us to understand the drama in context. It also helps us to understand the drama in real history, and I think that that's a good thing. But you know, one of the things I discovered as I was writing this book on the chronology of the Bible is that Bible chronology itself is a rich soil for the growth of controversies. Have you noticed that?
Yes, and I was just going to get to that next point, because not everybody believes. First of all, the Bible's generally in chronological order, but not exactly, and all it takes is a couple of places where there's one of these intramural discussions about where this fits in the Old Testament, for example, that causes all sorts of people to write whole doctoral dissertations on that, right?
Well, that's right, and obviously this is an obvious a controversy, not just for the scholars, but even for lay people. There are many areas of disagreement that relate to Bible chronology. Just to mention a few, you know, what about the days of creation? Were they 24 hours each, or were they ages of time? That's an issue of Bible chronology. And that brings up related issues like young earth versus old earth, creationism versus evolution or theistic evolution, What about the extended lifetimes of people like Adam who lived 930 years? Is that literal or figurative? Well, that relates to Bible chronology. What about the book of Job? It's right in the middle of the Old Testament, but, it really belongs closer to Genesis. What about the book of Revelation? When was it written? Was it written early, as in 70 A.D. or prior to 70 A.D., as some people try to argue? Or was it late, back around 95 A.D.? And what about the teachings of Jesus during the 3-year ministry in the 4 Gospels? There's a lot of discussion about what happened when, because the 4 Gospels don't portray things in the exact same order. And so what I'm trying to say is that there's just one controversy after another that emerges when you're talking about Bible chronology. And so let me just warn you, Kerby, if you ever want to write a book like this in the future, there's a lot of study you have to do. There's a whole lot of issues.
Well, one of the things you say early on in the book is that even if I can't necessarily nail down the right year, I can at least put you, as you said, in the ballpark. And that's helpful because, like you said, we are fortunate when we read the Bible that it has a general chronological feel, which is unlike, say, the Quran, which just has nothing to do with the chronology in terms of how it was written. But even so, at least it helps you understand what was taking place at the time and why some of these things are happening. And again, it also helps you understand that there are differences from the beginning or the birth of Israel, what happens during the United Monarchy or when the kingdoms were divided, when the Israelites were in exile, or of course then when you come even to the New Testament, the whole issue of Jesus Christ, and then, of course, the early church. So this is just a helpful way to get into God's Word. And because you've broken it down into 365 days, you can start at any time you want. But if you just read a piece each day, you will have a much better insight into what you're reading. So I would encourage people to read the verses on the top of the sheet for that day, then to read the commentary. And this, first of all, will keep you honest about reading through the Bible, because I'm a firm believer in having everybody read through the Bible once a year if they can do so. And that gives them an opportunity to not only read through the Bible, but to spend a few more minutes with you and look at and understand the significance of what they've just read.
Well, that's exactly right. And I also try to make this as devotional as I can, and I focus on the people, the main people. You really come away from the book understanding the big picture. And, very often people look at the Bible and they read about the people of the Bible in isolated fragments. And they don't understand the epic value of what's taking place in the whole Bible. But when you read it chronologically, one person after the other, who comes into contact with this person and that person, who gives birth to this other person, as you start to unfold the drama in that way, it does start to take on a lot more interest because you understand people in context and you understand events in context. It's kind of like leaving the Western mindset here in 2019 and going back to Bible times and walking through the whole drama in a rapid fashion. Obviously, we're doing it in a year, but still doing it that way just helps you to take yourself out of the Western mindset and to understand things as they unfolded back then.
Well, again, it is a resource that has been out for about a year, but I have never really had a chance to talk to you about that. So if you go to our website, pointofview.net, you can see that we have a link to the paperback edition of this or the Kindle edition, and either way would be just a great resource to put in your hands. It's published by our friends at Harvest House. Because it's been out for about a year, maybe you can find it in your local bookstore, but if you cannot, we've provided that opportunity for you to do so. And of course, as always, we do have a link to ronrhodes.org so that you can follow what he has at Reasoning from the Scriptures Ministries. But I thought when we come back, we would move from this very good book on the chronological tour through the Bible into questions of prophecy. And that's this book, Jesus and the End Times, which came out earlier this year. So we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Ron Rhodes right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Dennis Prager recently wrote a column presenting 5 arguments against America is a racist country. His first argument was based on a previous column that asked, if America is so racist, why are there so many race hoaxes? It's a good question. If racism is as prevalent as activists want us to believe, you wouldn't expect so many hate crime hoaxes based on race. In previous columns, I've written about the number of fake hate crimes. There are even websites devoted to the long and growing list of them. All of them come from people trying to prove that this country is full of racism, homophobia, and Islamophobia. In a number of cases, the perpetrators are merely trying to draw attention to themselves. Dennis Prager provides a dozen examples of race hoaxes. Some are fairly well known, like the allegations against the Duke lacrosse team back in 2006. Others are not so familiar. It was amazing to me how many of the examples he provided involved a noose hanging on a truck or around a university lamp. Of course, we have the noose found at the garage of the NASCAR driver Bubba Wallace that was merely a garage pole that existed long before he was assigned that garage. And there's the story of Jesse Smollett. He was supposedly attacked by people wearing MAGA hats and added a noose around his neck to make it even more convincing. The rope was purchased by his 2 conspirators a few days before. You would think the Jesse Smollett incident would diminish the number of race hoaxes, but I found 2 more just the other day. A university student said he found a racist note on his car, but surveillance cameras only saw him near the car. And an Oregon commissioner candidate claimed a racist note was put in his mailbox. Eventually, he admitted he actually wrote it. Unfortunately, these race hoaxes keep coming week after week. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, we're going to be talking with Dr. Ron Rhodes about Jesus and the End Times. It's a book that came out earlier this year, what he said and what the future holds. It is also published by Harvest House. We have information about it on our website, but of course you probably would also be able to find it in your local bookstore. But if you can't find it there, we certainly want to focus some time and attention on this. And Ron Rhodes, you've written 70 books. And yet this is one of those ones where you say, yeah, this would have been a really good book to have written even years ago, because people say, well, everything you say about prophecy, well, those are written by Paul. I'm going, no, there were a lot of prophetic statements by Jesus, and sometimes we tend to read past them because we're looking for insights on how to live the Christian life or Sermon on the Mount or whatever. And yet Jesus was really giving quite a bit of prophetic teaching in the Gospels, wasn't he?
Well, he did, and I would say even broader than that. Jesus is the ultimate source of all prophecy, in my view. For example, we read about the Old Testament prophets. You know, all these different prophets in the Old Testament spoke about the end times. But in 1 Peter 1:11, we are told that the prophets spoke by the Spirit of Christ. It was the Spirit of Christ within them. Some people will say that was Christ. Others say it was the Holy Spirit. Even if it was the Holy Spirit, the Holy Spirit helps us to understand the words of Christ, according to John's Gospel. So either way, the source of those prophecies is Jesus. The book of Revelation, right there in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, tells us that John's revelation came from Jesus Christ.
Right.
Likewise with the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul was the spokesperson of Jesus. And Jesus himself said that Paul is my chosen instrument to take my message to the Gentiles and to kings and the people of Israel. And so part of my message involves all the prophecies that the Apostle Paul wrote about. And so whether Jesus is speaking directly, like in the Olivet Discourse, or through Paul or through the Old Testament prophets or the revelation he gave to John, Jesus is the source. And I think that's one of those things that a lot of people tend to neglect.
Yeah, and I think you've done a very good job of explaining that Jesus spoke through the Old Testament prophets. He then, of course, had the prophetic teaching in the Gospels. And the one that people tend to miss all the time is the book of Revelation is a revelation from Jesus Christ. So we're going to be looking at all those different elements. And so, again, it's an excellent book that has 12 chapters. We'll do our best to try to cover a number of them. But the first one is one that would have been a surprise, I think, for some of our listeners, because I've had some people that said, some of you that believe in a rapture, well, that's just something that Paul wrote about. And yet here you have the first chapter talking about the fact that Jesus promises to rapture us. Where do we find that?
Well, we find that in John 14, verses 1 to 3, where Jesus says, "Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me. There is more than enough room in my Father's house. If this were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When everything is ready, I will come and get you, so that you will always be with me where I am." Now, some people, of course, will try to say, well, this must refer to the second coming. But Jesus says he's preparing a place for us, and when he comes to get us, he's going to take us back to that place that he's prepared. So, this is not what happens at the second coming. This is a reference, I believe, to the rapture of the church. And it's perfectly consistent with what you read about the rapture in Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 13 through 18, and in the book of Revelation, chapter 3, verse 10, and other passages.
And that's one of the things that I thought was very telling, because you do see a parallel that you have in the book. This is worth the book alone, before we even get past the first chapter, between John 14, verses 1 and 3, and then 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 to 18. So some people that say, well, that idea of rapture, that was created later on, or it was something that Paul came up with. No, you see just an incredible parallel between what Jesus says and what Paul says. And so that, I thought, was just a very significant insight in the first chapter of the book.
Well, in John 14, it says that, Jesus himself affirms, "I will come." Likewise, Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4 says that Christ will come down from heaven. In John 14, Jesus says to believers, "I will take you to myself." In 1 Thessalonians 4, it says that believers will be caught up to meet Christ in the air. In John 14, it says believers will be with him. Jesus says, "You will always be with me where I am." Whereas in 1 Thessalonians 4, it affirms that believers will be with the Lord forever. And then in John 14, Jesus says the purpose of this revelation about the rapture is so that their hearts would not be troubled. Likewise, in 1 Thessalonians 4, the purpose of the revelation about the rapture is to minimize grief and to bring about encouragement. And that encouragement is especially important because all of us have lost people to death. Yes. What about our Christian loved ones? And so, to me, it's not surprising that there are similarities of teaching between Jesus and Paul, because Jesus himself said that Paul was my chosen instrument who will speak my message.
Yes. So again, a lot of that's just in that first chapter, and in just a few minutes we'll get into, over the next hour probably, the whole idea of the parable of the fig tree and some of the other prophetic statements, as well as in the days of Noah. But let's get to this idea of the tribulation. You devote 2 chapters to this. And again, the word tribulation has different shades of meaning, but again, it's a time that the listeners to Point of View would not like to go through. And Jesus gives us a pretty good idea of what it indeed would be like, doesn't he?
Well, he does. And of course, we all go through some aspect of tribulation while we're on the earth. There's general tribulation that all Christians go through, but there's also a specific period of tribulation that will last 7 years prior to the second coming of Christ. And, Jesus talks a lot about this in different places. When you read through Matthew 24, for example, we read the Olivet Discourse. Right. And Jesus talks about nations rising up against nations and wars and rumors of wars. He talks about the abomination of desolation when the Jewish temple becomes desolate. He warns about the rise of false Christs and false apostles and teachers. And all of this parallels perfectly what we read about the seal judgments in the book of Revelation, chapter 6 and following. And again, that's what you would expect, since the revelation that went to John ultimately came from Jesus. Now, you're right. The listeners of your broadcast don't want to be here. It's going to be a period that Scripture says will be characterized by wrath, judgment, indignation, trial, trouble, destruction, darkness, desolation, overturning, and punishment. Now, Kerby, allow me to clarify something. I personally believe that the rapture is going to happen before this time, but I've heard some people say that the only reason we believe in that is because we don't want to go through that period, or that we're afraid to go through the period. That's really not true. I mean, nobody wants to go through that period, but pre-tribulationists are pre-trib because they believe in the Bible. And so let's just establish that, being a biblicist is much more important than whatever particular theological persuasion you hold to, whether it's pre-trib or post-trib. We should all strive to be biblicists first and foremost. And that includes dealing with the tribulation period.
One other thing about the tribulation before we take a break is this idea of deception. And you spend a fair amount of time talking about that as well, because that seems, is it fair to say, really almost unprecedented? That's a different we have a lot of deception today, but you do believe that that may be something that is certainly things that we've never really seen before.
Well, the thing is that following the rapture of the church, you're no longer going to have the Spirit of truth working on the earth through the church. That's the Holy Spirit working through the church. And if all Christians are removed, there's no one there to defend the truth. God will certainly raise up 2 prophetic witnesses and 144,000 Jewish witnesses to speak the truth. But when the rapture of the church takes place, that kind of greases the skids for the rapid escalation of apostasy. And, that's going to make it easier for people to fall for the lies of the Antichrist and the false prophet who sets forth a false religion.
Wow. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But I wanted to cover some of this because I thought this book would be very helpful to you. It came out a couple of months ago, so it's already probably available in your bookstore if you would like to find it there. And if you can't, of course, we have a link to that so that you can get it in either a paperback or in Kindle. And we also have a link to ronrhodes.org. His organization is called Reasoning from the Scriptures Ministries. And so you've got some great material there about his different books and videos and all sorts of other articles that I think you would find very helpful. And if you have a question, I can't think of anybody I know who does a better job in answering each individual question that he receives. Now, of course, if we do a program like this, he gets a lot of questions at once, so don't expect instantaneous response, but he has always been so dedicated to answer everybody's question, and so that's something else that you can find as you go to his website, ronrhodes.org, Reasoning from Scriptures Ministries. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue conversation today with Dr. Ron Rhodes as we continue talking about his book, Jesus and the End Times. And one of the things you talk about is the parable of the fig tree. Now, it is interesting how many times fig trees and figs were used in some kind of teaching, but Jesus, especially in Matthew 24, spends some time talking about learn a lesson from the fig tree. Explain that if you might.
Well, it's a very important lesson. He talks about the fact that when the fig tree's branches bud and its leaves begin to sprout, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, that is to say the signs of the times that were just mentioned,
right,
you can know that his return is very near, right at the door. And that's a very important statement because it indicates that there's going to be a correlation between the prophecies in the Bible, including Jesus' prophecies, and what transpires in the world. I make that point, Kerby, because sometimes I'm criticized for saying that we should be observers of the world to see if there's any correlations between what's going on in the world and what the biblical prophets spoke about. Very clearly, for this generation that's going to live during the tribulation period, they're going to witness certain things take place, like the rise of nation against nation and the rise of false prophets and false Christs and the abomination of desolation. They're going to see these things start to happen. And Jesus is indicating, listen, when you see this stuff start to happen, mark my words, everything is coming to an end quickly. And I think that he said that because he wants to encourage those believers who happen to be alive during the tribulation period. Now, that might surprise some people to hear that there will be Christians there, and there will be. I believe that Christians will be raptured before that period, but there will be new believers who become believers as a result of the ministry of the two great prophets of Revelation 11, as well as the 144,000 Jewish witnesses who proclaim the gospel of the kingdom all over the world. And so that's why Revelation 7 speaks of a great multitude of believers. And all that happens in the tribulation period. And so in order to encourage them in the midst of all this stuff going wrong, Jesus tells them, when you see this stuff start to happen, really start to build up your faith because you know that everything's about to come to an end and that you're going to be with me forever.
And again, then the kind of the counter to that is in chapter 5, where you see, of course, like the days of Noah, because he points out that no one knows the day or the hour when these things will happen, but at the same time, it will be like in the days of Noah. So you use that to say that even though we should pay attention to the signs, we should avoid date setting, and you go through some pretty sad examples of failed predictions, and I appreciate the fact you put that in there because every time you talk about prophecy, we all know how people then point to these failed predictions that were made that aren't based upon any kind of biblical understanding, but just simply because they want to attract attention to their particular prophetic ideas.
Well, that's right. And I think it's important to understand that when Jesus talked about the fig tree, that's a tribulation context very specifically. We're not in the tribulation yet. That's a tribulation context where Jesus is talking about the fig tree and when you see this stuff start to happen. Now, Jesus did say that we could not know the day or the hour, but the prophecies, I think, are indicated to give us an idea that we're in the season of the Lord's return.
Right.
We cannot set dates, and we're not supposed to set dates, and I do give some bad examples. And to tell you the truth, I hate it when Christians set, dates for the rapture or for whatever else, because guess what? 5 months later, you start to read articles about this in atheist and humanistic magazines. Those guys love to talk about silly Christians who are setting dates. So I say, why give the enemies of Christianity ammo? And that's aside from the fact that Jesus himself told us that we cannot know the day or the hour.
Well, very good. Let's get into some of these other parables. I mean, there are just quite a number, and you begin to realize that when you start turning the pages in your book, because you have the parable of the great feast, a parable of the wheat and the weeds, or the wheat and the tares, depending on how you say it, the parable of growing seed, of the mustard seed, of yeast. And these are all important parables, and each one of them help us understand a little bit more about the kingdom of heaven, don't they?
Well, they really do, and obviously we don't have the time to go through all of them, but, just consider what Jesus is doing here. He's using word pictures, and by using word pictures, he helps people to understand stuff that they could not understand before. Just to give you an example, he talks about the parable of the fishing net, and he talks about how the kingdom of heaven is kind of like a fishing net thrown into the water and catches fish of every kind, and there's good fish and there's bad fish. There's good people and there's wicked people. And that would seem to indicate that in this age in which we live, there will be both genuine believers and phony professing Christians that coexist within the kingdom. And it's only at the end of the age that there will be a separation of the righteous from the unrighteous. If you can picture in your mind, Kerby, a fisherman pulling a net up out of the water and putting all those fish on the floor of his boat, he picks up some of them and throws them back into the water because they're no good. Whereas he keeps the good ones. Well, this is a word picture to help us to understand that there's going to be a separation at the end, where the good are going to be separated from the wicked. There are professing Christians even today who will go to church, but they have no relationship with Jesus Christ. They have no interest in reading the Bible. They have no interest in obedience to the Lord. They're Christian in name only. And so, that's food for thought. I tell you what, that's relevant stuff for us to be aware of, because I'm pretty sure that nobody listening to my voice wants to be counted among those to whom Christ says, "Depart from me, because I never knew you."
Wow.
That's something for us to think about, because a lot of people are assuming they're Christians, but what if you're not really a Christian? What if you're just a church attender? Have you really read the Bible and understood what a Christian actually is? And so, that's one of the applications of that particular parable, and there's a bunch more that we could look at, but I know the time forbids.
Yes, but again, just to underscore that just a minute, certainly I don't want any of our listeners to say, I go to church, so we're good. God grades on the curve, and I'm better than a lot of people I know, so that's all fine. And no, that's not exactly what the gospel is, and we certainly have spent time trying to talk about that. And even before the end of this program, I hope we can maybe once again make sure that you are certain that you are saved and you are headed to heaven. And one of the things I think is very powerful in this piece that you have here is you recognize that the parables address different issues. I mentioned just a minute ago, some of the parables are about the kingdom of heaven. We just a minute ago talked about the parable of the fig tree, which really relates to the tribulation. And then things like the parable of the talents or the parable of the 10 servants, that really relates in the future to the millennial kingdom. So this is helpful too, because even as people read these parables, they need to figure out where it fits, back to our word chronology, where it fits in terms of kind of the end times chronology. True?
Well, that's exactly right. And you have to understand the audience. Jesus was talking to a first century Jewish audience, and he was speaking their language. He was using terms that they were familiar with. And that's really the best method of teaching, And even today, those who are experts in what's called pedagogy, the study of how to teach, will point out that we think in terms of analogies. And so Jesus is using analogies based upon something that the people were already familiar with, and using that to treat them something about either the tribulation period or the kingdom that follows. And in the parable of the great feast, it would seem that Jesus was teaching that the king and his kingdom had been offered to the nation of Israel, but the Jews were indifferent to the offer. The Jews even murdered the deliverers of the message, that is to say, the prophets. And so now the invitation has been broadened to include everyone, including the Gentiles. And so the kingdom is going to be made up of saved Gentiles and saved Jewish people. And, after you read through this stuff and understand it in context, it really does make a lot of sense.
And again, this is a book that goes through some of those parables and then talks about the second coming of Jesus Christ, what we just mentioned a little bit in passing, the judgment of the nations in the millennial kingdom, then the eternal state, and even the lessons learned from the 7 churches. And so when we come back, we've obviously skipped over some aspects of the millennial kingdom, but many of you might say, okay, I really forget that Jesus is actually in the book of Revelation. Of course, that's the title of it, but nevertheless, that's a part that I think would be helpful. And so as we come back from the break, I'd like to talk about some of the lessons we can learn from these 7 churches in the book of Revelation, because that's kind of the end part of all of that. And then just, of course, this book helps you understand why you can trust biblical prophecy, what it means in terms of being prepared, and also what it does in terms of creating a real sense of urgency to go out and to preach the gospel. So all of it found in this book, Jesus and the End Times, what he said and what the future holds. And it takes you through the different ways in which Jesus addresses this in the Gospels. But when we come back, I want to talk about what does Jesus say in the book of Revelation. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Ron Rhodes with us as we talk about his book, Jesus and the End Times. And we really are skipping over some very significant chapters, but in the interest of time, I thought it might be worthwhile to focus on lessons learned from the 7 churches. Now, again, 7 churches, we may not have a time to look at all 7, but I thought, Ron, this would be helpful because in some respects, it brings us back to the so what question, because here Jesus addresses these churches in the early chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation. And in some respects, the churches that you see there in Asia Minor maybe represent even the churches we have today here in the 21st century. So what are some of the things that Jesus actually shares with them?
Well, that's a great question because we do learn from what he said to them. Jesus would typically affirm what the church was doing right, and then he would tell them what they were doing wrong. And in one case, with the church in Ephesus, Jesus told them that they did do some things good. They didn't tolerate evil people, nor did they tolerate phony apostles. But Christ also had words of correction for them and told them that they needed to turn back to him. You know, they don't love me. They don't love each other. They don't love others the way that they should and the way that they did at first. And so what I learned from that is simply this. Doctrinal accuracy and moral purity are very important, but these are not enough. Supreme love for God and others is also necessary. Christianity is more than just being doctrinally correct. It involves an ongoing love relationship with the Lord. And I think that was the burning issue that the Lord was dealing with the church of Ephesus. Now, that's relevant to us, isn't it?
Oh, it certainly is.
You know, we have a lot of formalism in churches today. We go through the motions, we go to Bible studies, and those things are all good. But do you have that kind of a burning love that Jesus is talking about? Or do you have a Christianity that's more about just being doctrinally correct? Now, you're hearing an apologist say that, Kerby.
Yes.
I place a high premium on teaching the truth. But the fact is that Christianity is more than the truth. It's more than holding to the truth. There's also that loving, personal relationship with the Lord.
And so, again, each one of these churches that we talk about are providing, if you will, an opportunity to see what they did correctly and then to actually receive words of admonition and even exhortation to do the right things. And some of them are pretty much getting relatively good passing marks. Some of them are really being very criticized, I guess you should say. Laodicea certainly comes to mind, and others that are certainly not that way. So where would we learn maybe some other the lessons that are very important for us here in the 21st century?
Well, the fact is that we learn from each one of these. The Laodiceans, of course, they were very wealthy and commercially successful. And, there's nothing wrong with being commercially successful, but that's not enough, is it? What does Scripture have to say? Christ himself said, I would rather that you were neither cold or hot. I would rather that you would be cold or hot, not in between. You see, these were lukewarm believers. And there's nothing more than being lukewarm. And I think this kind of goes along with what I was saying before. A lot of Christians kind of go through the motions of formality, they do their regular spirituality and church attending and all like that. But the question is, are you hot on fire for the Lord, or are you characterized more by being lukewarm? Jesus says that he doesn't like lukewarm, and he's going to spit the lukewarm out of his mouth. That's kind of a horrific word picture when you think about it.
Yes.
But, we learn from this kind of stuff. These guys are so important for us, Kerby, for one reason, and that is that when we think about Jesus, we always think about him being love incarnate, and he is love incarnate. There's no more loving person on earth that ever existed than Jesus. But you know what? Jesus is talking to people who are in churches and Christians, and he speaks pretty strict words to them about getting the stuff that's wrong right. And so even though Christ is a lover of people and a lover of Christians, Jesus himself is also a lover of truth, and he will take disciplinary measures if Christians choose not to respond. Now, of course, he does it in love. He does that discipline in order to restore believers and bring them back into a right relationship with God. But nevertheless, sometimes that discipline can hurt. And that's what Jesus, I think, is talking about in these 7 churches.
Very good. Just before I let you go, let me mention that you have a postscript there. You can trust biblical prophecy, and I appreciate you putting that in there because, after all, you are an apologist, and you quote, of course, yourself and Norm Geisler and others to point out that there have been some people that have said, well, what look like prophecies actually in the Old Testament were written closer to the time of Christ. And so these messianic prophecies were Christian inventions. First of all, that doesn't work at all because we have, Dead Sea Scrolls and a lot of things to show that's not the case. And then the idea that, well, Jesus really wasn't making prophetic statements. Well, of course he is. And so I appreciate you putting that in there because you know as well as I do that a young person going off to college or even getting out on the internet and seeing some of these websites will hear people arguing that these really aren't prophecies, but they really are. And to me, one of the greatest evidences of God's fingerprints on the Scriptures is the amount of Old Testament prophecy already fulfilled, the prophecies fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And that gives us confidence that these prophecies that have not been fulfilled will be fulfilled in the future.
That's right. In fact, that's the guiding rule that I've always used in writing all my prophecy books. And I've also held that when the plain sense makes good sense, seek no other sense lest you end up in nonsense. And that's just based upon a literal understanding of Scripture. That's why we can say that if you want to understand how God is going to fulfill prophecy in the future, take a look at how he has fulfilled prophecy in the past, because God is consistent. God doesn't change his methods halfway through. He has been perfectly consistent in fulfilling those prophecies literally. Like Jesus being born of a virgin, Isaiah 7:14, being pierced for our sins, Zechariah 12:10, being born in Bethlehem, Micah 5:2. all those are literal. And in the same way, all the second coming prophecies and all the events that lead up to the second coming, those prophecies will be fulfilled just as literally.
Again, the book is entitled Jesus and the End Times, written by Dr. Ron Rhodes. We also have a link to ronrhodes.org and Reasoning from the Scriptures Ministries. And you've got a great picture there where you're standing next to Bob Hawkins, who I've known at president of Harvest House Publishers, over 1 million books sold. And again, that's a great award that you received. And again, one of the reasons why we commend your books to individuals, they have had such an incredible impact on the body of Christ, and it's always great to have you on the program. So I look forward to the next opportunity, and thank you today for giving us a chance to not only know about this chronological tour through the Bible, but also this book that came out this year, Jesus and the End Times. So, Ron, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's always a pleasure, and there's nothing I'd rather talk about than the Bible.
Well, again, we encourage you to find out more about Ron Rhodes. We have a link to him on the website. If you'd like to listen to it again, of course, you can download the podcast or watch it on YouTube. And that is all we have for today. Let me mention that tomorrow, what are we going to do? Well, first of all, we're going to spend some time on our weekend edition kind of looking at some of the issues in the news. One of the callers yesterday said, well, we need to talk about China. We're going to do so and really give you a little bit of an understanding on where are we in terms of this trade war with China. What about the military aggression of China? What about 70 years of communist rule in China? What about the one-child policy? So we're going to talk about that. Of course, we'll give you an update on the impeachment inquiry, and we'll look at Campaign 2020 and a number of other topics that are in the news. So we've got a lot to cover tomorrow, and we will do that here on Point of View. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things you've covered today, some of the articles, and some of the resources, they're all available at our website, pointofview.net. And as you go there, I hope you'll also click on that button that says Truth Team. Join the Truth Team. Help us financially. We greatly would appreciate that. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup.